You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes.
48% of podcast titles that are on Apple Podcasts have less than 10 episodes. They haven't thought far enough ahead. And Podfade hits in a major way because there is work that goes into it. Am I always 10 episodes planned out? Absolutely not. No,
that's like dream number, right? Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. I created my first podcast in 2019 called A Vietnam Podcast, and I have something really exciting to share with you today. From that podcast, I then created 7 Million Bikes Podcasts, and we now help people all over the world make the best podcast possible. We've worked with over 60 podcasts, produced over 700 episodes, helped with millions of downloads, and helped podcasts get to the top of the charts. And this podcast here, Smarter Podcasting, is here to help you make the best podcast possible. So I share my own tips and tricks, my failures, and I talk to experts in the industry. Now, in this episode, if you've been listening for a while, you will know that consistency is key when it comes to podcasting. And this year, we've committed to bringing out an episode every week. Unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not able to create new episodes, but I want to be consistent. Sometimes life gets in the way, and I'm not going to stop that get in the way of my consistency. And so I'm still going to be bringing you new episodes every week, and I'm not going to be leaving you empty-handed. So I'm going to bring you back older episodes that are just as valuable now as the day they were released, and maybe you didn't even hear it. So this one is packed with insights on how to plan your podcast effectively and avoid the dreaded Podfade, a challenge that so many podcasters face. If you're looking to build a long-lasting, successful show, you don't want to miss this episode. And if you find this episode helpful, please make sure to share it with other podcasters, subscribe, follow, turn on notifications, and best of all, if you want to work with 7 Million Bikes Podcast, get in touch with me, neil@7millionbikes.com, or the link is in the notes, and I will talk to you soon. So enjoy this episode. Cheers. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of planning out your podcast content and how it can help take your show to the next level. If you've ever found yourself struggling to come up with new content, fresh ideas, or take a new direction for your podcast, well then you're in luck, because today we're going to cover all of that with Brian Biedenbach. He's going to be sharing some valuable insights on how to plan your content effectively. We talk a little bit about Podfade in this episode. Podfade is when a podcast episode just disappears after 10 episodes. This happens to anywhere from 50 to 75% of all podcasts. I'm sure you know of a podcast that started, you really enjoyed it, and it suddenly stopped. And this definitely was a big thing that happened during the pandemic. Everyone was stuck inside, so everyone started making podcasts, and then they all stopped suddenly, once they could go outside again, which makes sense. I want this podcast and everything I do to help you not only make 10 episodes, but to make 50 or 100, whether you're starting a podcast for the first time or you're building an existing one. And if you've already got one, I want to help you take that podcast to the next level. Brian shares with you how to plan out great content using content buckets, what they are, and how to fill them. So let's go talk to Brian. I'm so excited to share this with you. There's so much valuable information in here. So let's go check it out. So Brian, thank you so much for joining me. We've obviously talked previously on your podcast, Good Podcasting. And then I've just used that episode on the previous episode of Smarter Podcasting, where I realized I just sound like a stereotypical Scotsman. I'm talking about how to podcast on a budget and just living up to type that Scottish people are cheap. Planning out content, it's something that I do a little bit, but I've not done a lot because I'm more a fly by the seat of my pants kind of guy, and I like to just get things done. So when we talking about planning out content, I was really excited because I know the listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this. But mostly I'm being selfish. I'm going to get a lot of value out of this. So Brian, tell us then your strategies for planning out content.
Yeah. So I probably go the other way, and I probably plan too much, and I'm learning to fly by the seat of my pants a little bit more. I tell the story often on my show that the guy that he's back co-hosting with me now, Chase Wagner, this co-hosting Good Podcasting with me, was the guy that I started podcasting with. And we would go back and forth because I would have a scripted out episode. And he's like, what are we doing? We just need to talk. Just tell me what the topic and we'll go. And it frustrated the heck out of me. And for him, I was frustrating him, right? Because I was so like organized and structured. He's like, I don't want to say that. So anyway, planning out content is something that I need to do to make myself feel like I'm ready to enter into a show. So whether that's future planning, like having a month or 2 months worth of episodes that I know what I'm going to do. So even I can promo next episode when I'm finishing up one episode, or it's like bullet points for this particular episode. Like I just have to have I tell people it's like a roadmap for me. Like I know where I'm starting the conversation. I know where I want to land. Maybe not the person's answer, right? But the question I want to ask. And so if I have have the conversation mapped out, it's easier for me. So if we get off script, we take a detour, we can come back and I know where we're going. So planning out my content is super important to me just to help me stay focused, even as we kind of riff and talk back and forth and go on detours here and there. So yeah.
It's interesting. There's just two different types of people. Well, there's many different types of people, right?
Right.
And there's one type of one type of person. So I learned this in university. It's called like paralysis by analysis.
Oh, yep.
And elite level athletes have it where they overanalyze. You're pointing to yourself. Well, it comes from elite level athletes where if you overanalyze your performance, and it can be any sport, archery, long jump, running, you can look at how you take off for 100 meters race and you're looking at your foot and you're trying to analyze, if I move my foot by 1 centimeter, I'm going to get a better takeoff. And then I'm going to get half a second off my performance or a 0.01 second off my performance. But then you end up thinking about it so much, you paralyze yourself and you do none of that and your performance gets worse. And there's like a bell curve of that. Where's the sweet spot? I'm somewhere probably near the front where I try not to think about things too much and just get it done. And it's something I always talk to my clients about. I talk about it in my course. For me, and I'm a different type of person. I just want to get things done and I want other people to get things done. So I really want people to avoid that paralysis by analysis where they're worrying about what equipment to buy, how to buy it, how much it's going to cost. They're worrying about how they're going to plan out their episodes. How many episodes do they plan out? How do they do it? And they end up doing nothing. And a year goes by and 5 years goes by and they still haven't started their podcast. So this is a good conversation because we're somewhere in the middle. When you're planning out your episode, let's start off by 10 episodes ahead, 5 episodes ahead. What do you sit and plan out? And then let's break it down into per episode.
Yeah. So when I'm working with clients, because I do similar work as you, working with clients, getting them started and editing and doing the post-production for them, I really want them, if it's a new person, I really want them to have 10 episodes scheduled or an idea. Because statistics are showing that I think last time I looked just a few months ago, like I think 48% of podcast titles that are on Apple Podcasts have less than 10 episodes. And so people get into it, they haven't thought far enough ahead. And Podfade hits in a major way because there is work that goes into it. And just because you have a big idea and you start talking, you get 2 episodes in and go, I said everything I wanted to say. I thought I could say more, right? So there's whatever the reason is, there's all these barriers and obstacles that people don't get to that 10th episode. And when you get to the 10th episode, you can get to 50 a lot easier. And you get to 50, you get to 100, right? So I'm thinking in terms of, at least on the front end, let's get at least 10 episodes planned out. Am I always 10 episodes planned out? Absolutely not. No,
that's like the dream, right? I tell myself that as well. I'm going to plan out. I did plan out 10 episodes for this show, so we'll see how that goes. Like, that's the dream number, right?
Yeah. And so I always like to at least have ideas of shows that are coming up. So I won't have them sketched out until typically, honestly, anymore, because I'm working with Chase, who is more fly by the seat of his pants. And I've learned to adapt and he's learned to adapt to me a little bit, that we'll throw topics out. And I'll talk about how we come up with those. We'll throw topics out and then we'll meet for about an hour before we start recording and we'll sketch out each episode because we already have the topics in mind that we've had some time to think about, right, and process through. So when I'm doing that, for me, it always goes back to, like, we don't want to spend a lot of time here necessarily, but I always think about why am I doing this podcast, right? I always think about who's my audience. And I have to do this for every show, Neil, really. And then understanding what's the value that I'm bringing to my audience. So my podcast is good podcasting, as you already mentioned, very similar to your show here that we're doing. And so I'm always thinking, I'm talking to that person that is wanting to start a podcast. And there's all sorts of things we can talk about, right? When it comes to podcasting. Am I going to do an episode about EQing your sound to a beginner podcaster? Probably not. But in the back of my head, that's always a topic, right? So I'm like, let's save that for another time, another podcast potentially, right? We need to talk about beginner things for beginner podcasters. So those are kind of the three things that I'm always thinking through, filtering through is why am I doing this? Who's my audience and what value can I bring them?
Did you hear that? That is amazing advice. Make sure you copy that down. Those 3 things that you should do for every single episode. Why am I doing this? Who's my audience and what value am I giving them? No matter what your podcast is about, if you make sure that every episode follows those 3 things, then you're doing something right. Listen more for Brian. He has some amazing tips. I wanted to share with you about one of my favorite affiliate partners, and that is Fiverr. I've been using Fiverr for years for everything from ordering YouTube thumbnails to keyword research, writing podcast articles, even to Canva designs and thumbnails and more. So whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a podcaster, or anyone in between, Fiverr has got you covered. It really is the go-to platform if you want to find freelancers offering a massive range of services to help you on any project. Maybe you need a stunning new logo or just a short animation, whatever you need, you can find it on Fiverr. What I love the most is how easy Fiverr makes it to connect with talented freelancers from around the world, all at prices that will fit whatever your budget is. Plus, with Fiverr's secure payment system, you can trust that your transactions are safe and secure. No dodgy people you meet on Facebook groups that disappear with your money and never give you what you want. What, that's only happened to me? As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you use the link and at no extra cost to you. As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you click my link and you buy something, all at no extra cost to you. And best of all, you will be directly supporting the making of this podcast that you're listening to for free, but it is not free to make. So why wait? Head over to somewhere that you've probably never been before. It's called the show notes. So whatever app you're listening in, if it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything at all, head to the show notes, click on my special link, and then you can browse thousands of gigs ready to help you with your next project.
And so once I get past there, so many people, I've heard this in different places. I wish I could quote where it actually came from. But the term content buckets is the term that I've been using as I think through how to plan this out. And really those content buckets for me it goes back to why am I doing this? Who am I doing it for? And what value do they offer? So my show is about helping new people, new podcasters create, launch, and grow their podcast. So those are kind of my 3 content buckets. A bucket for all the information to help someone create a podcast. What I mean by that is everything from designing your cover art to your title to what kind of topics are going to be. So creating the podcast to launching the podcast. How do you get set up? What are the apps you need? What's the technology you need to really get out there and launch and start building that audience? And then the grow bucket is what are the things you need now that you're off and running? How can I help you continue to grow?
This is absolutely fantastic. And I'm definitely going to be stealing this. I'm writing down notes as you're saying this. So tell me then, how do you fill those content buckets?
Yeah. So that's where just all the ideas come from. So if I have an idea, I'm writing notes down. If I have an idea, I'm typing it in a document on my computer. If I'm eating lunch with someone who's asking questions and I'm like, oh, that's a great question, maybe I'll do an episode on that. So I'm constantly logging ideas. And actually, it really just comes down to what bucket does this idea fit in, right? And so I mentioned EQing your sound, right? It's something that I love to do as I edit and produce podcasts, but it's not something a new podcaster needs to know how to do. So I have this topic that I'm like, where does this fit? Well, it probably doesn't, because I know who I'm talking to, what I'm about, and what value. That's value that they don't need yet. So it doesn't fit in that bucket. So it's almost like there's a filter, right? That does this topic fit in here? So the topics really, like I said, just come from things that trip me up sometimes when I'm setting someone up with a new podcast. So let's say, for example, just recently, I was working with the client. We had recorded 4 or 5 episodes already, but we hadn't published anything yet. And I just told him, I said, set up your Apple Podcast Connect account, right? Get that set up. I'll set up your host site. We'll get the two tied together and we're off and running. Well, he didn't know how to set up his Apple Podcast Connect account, right? And so I was like, okay, let's sit down. Let's walk through it. But we couldn't do it over the phone because there was something that just kept getting in the way. So I was like, let's meet, right? And it was something simple that I had done a long time ago that a new podcaster would sit down and go, I'm really frustrated with this. I'm not even going to do a podcast, or I'm not even going to put it on Apple Podcast. So it's things like that as I work with new podcasters that come up, that because I've been doing this so long and I've been on the platform so long, that I did a long time ago that I forget. So a lot of my ideas are generated just from conversations with clients, honestly. And then again, so my co-host Chase comes on, and I've done all the back end work. So he's on a microphone, and he and I go back and forth. We got good rapport and good chemistry, and we laugh a lot and we joke a lot, but he doesn't know the inner workings of mixing the sound and coming up with the topic. So he actually brings a lot of content, brings a lot of questions, as someone who really isn't a professional podcaster. He's just joining me because we have a lot of fun doing it, and he's good on the mic, right? So a lot of my questions come from him. So these are, again, I'm just talking in circles, I think, but ideas are coming from everywhere, from my own experience, from my client's experience, from my co-host asking questions. And it's just a matter of which bucket does this fit in. So we'll go through and we'll do an episode on something related to creating your podcast. And then maybe the next episode is something related to, now that you have a couple episodes, how do you get those out there? So we'll do something on launching your podcast. And so that's kind of how I fill those buckets. Topics come from everywhere.
I hope you're getting as much out of this as me. I'm absolutely loving what Brian is telling us here. So now you have your 3 buckets. Why am I doing this? Who is it for? And what value am I going to give the listener? Now, when you're planning out your content, just think about, how am I going to fill each of these buckets? Write down as many ideas as you can. Think of as much as you can. Write them all down and then see, where do they go? Do you fit those buckets? Then you're going to be able to create great content for your podcast. Brian's now going to share something really, really important with us. He's going to give some tips, the tools that he uses, and the tech that he uses to plan out his content.
And then I look at 3 other things that I think through is tips, tools, and tech is what I call it. And that's the tagline that I use on my YouTube channel. It's tips, tools, and tech to help you create a better podcast. And so that's another layer of filtering these topics is, okay, I've got a tip on how to do a great podcast interview. Where does that fit? Which bucket does that fit in? So what episode or what topic do we cover? Tools, I talk about apps and websites that are beneficial for new podcasters to think through, things like Descript that you and I talk about a lot about. So anyway, and then the tech is just the equipment technology. So anyway, so I got a couple layers of processing how to take this idea that's out here just in space somewhere and get it to an episode that really makes sense for that audience.
I think that's great advice for any podcast, what it's on. Because someone may be listening and they're not making a podcast about podcasters. We're being very incestuous here, and we're 2 podcasters talking about podcasting
Right.
on a podcast.
Yeah.
And someone listening is doing a podcast not about podcasting, I think there's still so much value in that, and finding that content that, no matter the niche of your podcast or the topic, I think it's very easy to do what you just said there, and I do it. where you think of something as being almost facile, or you're like, yeah, I mean, that's so simple. Like, of course, everyone knows how to connect to Apple Podcast. And just recently, I saw on a website somewhere was like, oh, we'll help you get your podcast on every platform, or something like this, or it was like a blog post. And I was like, yeah, that's so simple. Why would you need
Yeah.
help with that? And I mentioned it to my wife, and she's like, because not everyone knows how to do that. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah. So similar to you, what you're saying, there's something that we think, because we've done it so many times, that we know how to do it. And I have actually had to help clients get registered on Apple Connect and things like this.
Yeah.
And so there might be, I think it's really easy, no matter what topic or format or niche you have, to think like, oh, well, I know all of this stuff, so everyone else knows it. And really having to think about, well, what do my listeners need to know about? What do they want to know about?
Yeah. I think that's the key question, right? Is what do my listeners need from me? And what information or what education or are they just looking to laugh, right? Are they just looking to be entertained? Can I make them laugh? Is that my promise? So, what do they need and what can I deliver? And then as you think through your topics and your content buckets, what fits that I can deliver on that promise every episode? So I just taught a podcast workshop this weekend to give you a good example. And it was an 8-hour workshop. It was a long day, Neil. And we spent the first half of the day talking through this sort of thing, like designing your podcast, creating your content. And people were they looked a little antsy. Some looked a little bored because they had microphones in front of them and MacBook Pros in front of them. They wanted to record because that was the promise of this workshop, is you're going to go home with a finished product. It's just going to be a trailer episode, but you're going to go home with a finished product. Then we spent half the day talking about content. And then we got to lunch, and a couple of the guys that were there came and said, this isn't at all what I expected this workshop to be. And I was like, oh no, you paid to be here, right? And they were like, but I've never thought through any of these questions. This is exactly what I needed. I can figure out how to use a microphone, but I've never thought through these questions. And I was like, oh, phew. But the point is, I talk about these content buckets and I gave you my example of how I use them, but we walked through, I said, let's make up one today, a fictional podcast, so you understand what this looks like. So we did a podcast called Bad Dog, right? And it was a podcast for dog owners who just aren't good at it, was how we described this podcast. And not that it's coming from experience, but anyway, so we were like, what would those content buckets be? And so we talked about things like bad behaviors, annoyed neighbors, like how do we handle our neighbors that are annoyed with their dogs? And then how do we get better as dog owners, right? And so those were kind of the content buckets. And there's all sorts of things you can fill in there. And you don't need 3, you can have 2, you can have 5, whatever. But that was the idea, is to help people think, don't just use my example that's about podcasting. What is your podcast about? And what are the buckets that you can start filling with all these topics that you already know, or you wouldn't be wanting to start a podcast in the first place? It's just a way to organize thoughts, really.
That's so helpful, so useful. You mentioned about using tools and apps. So we've already talked about it on this podcast. If you haven't listened, go back and listen to the episode about using AI to boost your podcast. I use AI now for almost everything. I used AI for things I didn't realize I was using it. Like I've been using Descript for editing for so long now. And I didn't even think about that being an AI-driven technology. And it just seems so natural now for me to click a button and I get a transcript. I don't even think of that. And then I have to remind myself, like, when I started that, you had to pay somebody a lot of money to physically listen to your episode and transcribe it. And now it just is done by technology. That's where technology, like, you're like, oh my God, it becomes so normal. So I have used AI, ChatGPT specifically, to help me plan out content. So I train it, give it the information about the podcast, about me, what it's about, and then say, give me some content ideas. And it spits out these ideas and you're like, yeah, that's amazing. I could have come up with this, but it would have taken me maybe an hour. You've just done it in 30 seconds. Now, tell me, where are you on the AI scale? Are you using it? If not, and what tools are you using to help you plan out content?
Yeah. Well, what people might not know is that Neil is purely AI. This is an AI hosted podcast. No, not true. So I am just dabbling with AI. So I'm on the scale of, if you're like 100% in, I'm probably 25%. And I'm moving more that way. I have found it very helpful. I just recently started using Descript again, thought I'd give it another go. And I've been really impressed, honestly. So I'm using AI for more. I think that the tools that I use, I think just simply are notes, a notes app on my phone, a notebook, just writing ideas down. I typically always have my iPad with me. So just some way to take old school notes as you have ideas, or because there's so many ideas, there's so many questions I get. If I don't write it down, I lose it, right? And I forget. So don't lose sight of just old school technology, pen and paper. When you have ideas, write it down if you don't have another option. But I have gone the route of ChatGPT. And again, same thing that you mentioned, typing in the name of your show, the description of your show, and just saying, hey, give me 20 podcast topics for new podcasters. So that's a pretty broad one. And I could get about 12 decent ones out of that, right? That I have to filter through, like, does this fit my audience? Does this fit in one of these buckets? If not, I'll throw it out and maybe come back to it later.
Hey, sorry to interrupt this episode, but really quickly, I do have to give a shout out to Descript. So if you don't know already, I am an affiliate partner with Descript. And if you go to my episode on my blog about how to monetize a podcast, if you want to learn more about affiliates, you can do that. It just means that if you sign up for Descript or any affiliate product, I'll get a small commission for that and you get no extra charge at all. One of the reasons why I became an affiliate with Descript is because it literally revolutionized podcasting for me. The studio sound literally means that I can record right here in my living room. And it sounds like we're in a studio. I can edit out all the filler words. I can go through it and add compression, EQ. I can add video, GIFs. Everything you're seeing and hearing is from Descript. The link is in the show notes. Go check it out. There's a free version on there. You can try it out for free if you're not already using it. And if you do sign up, you'll be supporting the show because I'll get a small commission. So it's a win-win for everyone. All right, let's go back to the episode. I loved what you said there. And I think this is where people need to embrace AI, but realize it's not going to replace what you do. It's just going to speed it up so much. So you mentioned there that, you put it in, it gives you the ideas, but then you still have to filter it and you still have to look at my buckets and be like, okay, where does that fit in what bucket? So it's nowhere near, and I don't know if it will ever get to this stage, and I don't think we would want it to. It's not going to be like you just press a button and it creates a podcast, or, I use podcastmarketing.ai to create marketing assets. It's not at the stage yet where it's going to create, you're going to upload your podcast, you press a button and suddenly it's going to post it on social media. Maybe that will come, but I think you're always going to want to double check it. It's always going to need that human level. So I think anyone who is wary of AI, there's obviously much bigger conversations to be had about AI in the world, and we're not going to get into that. But for your podcast and for my business, it has sped up everything using AI, and I can't recommend it enough.
Yeah, 100%. So I just listened to your episode on AI, and so just new insights for me, even in the ways that you're using it, was really helpful for me. So I'm diving in a little bit more to figuring out how to use AI a little bit more. So let's say it's just for, maybe we're talking about planning out content, right? So maybe it is, I'll get a list of topics, right, from ChatGPT. I'll filter them, I'll put them in these buckets, and I'll go, okay, which one do I want to do? And so then I move it to a more of a planning app. I use Trello. I don't know, are you familiar with Trello? It's a project management. It's a free app or a free website. You can get an app on your phone or whatever. And it's project management, but I don't use it well for project management. All I do is to organize my thoughts. So you drop I have a list of, these are ideas. These are ideas that will be videos. These are ideas that will just be audio podcasts. And then these are ideas that I've filmed, I've recorded, they're done, and they're over. And so you just create these little cards, these electronic cards. I put the title of, let's say, how to get your podcast on Apple Podcast Connect might be the title of one. And then, so that the title's really clear, and then you click on it, it expands, and I just put notes in there. So I may not record this one for, a month or two, but when I come back, I have really good notes of, I know where to find it, and I know the notes that I've had, and maybe I've learned something since I wrote those down, and I can add to it and build it out. So do I do it well? I don't know. that I do it really well, but those are some of the simple tools, free tools that I use just to try and organize my thoughts. So when I sit down again to press record, I know where I'm going with this particular episode because I know I've been thinking about it for a while.
Perfect. It's so I hope people listening, they see themselves either they're going to be like, yeah, I'm Team Brian or I'm Team Neil, or they're going to be somewhere in between. Probably best to be more like Brian, I would say. And I love
I
the
don't know
old
about that.
school. I love the old school. You said like, oh, just taking notes, but it's overlooked by even people like myself. Anyone who's like me, they're probably not doing that. So that seems so simple, but such a fantastic piece of advice.
And I think we both have notebooks in front of us tonight, right? We're both talking
right
about
now.
taking
Yeah,
notes.
I'm taking my notes right now. Exactly.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, a highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.